everybody. I am so excited to be back with you here today with the start of a very special mini-series that's embedded in the midst of this season of the podcast. I'm not going to dig too deep into what we're doing here because I'm going to let this conversation unfold. My guest today, and really the co-host of this series, is Lulla. He's a former podcast guest. He's just become a great friend and a collaborator in some work that I'm doing behind the scenes to make the meaning movement more effective, help serve you and serve the world better, as we'll talk about a little bit in this episode. Just to introduce you to Raj, formally, he's the principal brand strategist at Fruitful Design and Strategy, which is a strategy and design company based in Omaha, Nebraska. He's also a husband, father of 3, and the author of the forthcoming novel, The Caring House. He's also just a really great guy. I don't even know, I could say so much about how meaningful it has been for me to just be on a bit of a journey with him as I've been retooling, repositioning, and working on making the meaning movement into everything that it could be. He's been just a really important partner in that journey. So I'm so excited for you to have the chance to just hear from him, hear some of the work that we've been doing, and also just to do a little bit of building in public here, showing more behind the scenes of what I'm doing, what I'm thinking about in my own life, as I'm thinking about my own quest for meaning, for satisfaction, for fulfillment, for success in the things that I'm doing. And I hope that this can be a helpful lens for you to look through your own work. As I'm processing my work, I know that you're processing yours, and I hope that you find this helpful. So let's get to it. This is the Meaning Movement Podcast. It's a show about work worth doing. It's about leveling up your mindset, helping you find more meaning, more fulfillment, more purpose, more satisfaction, more success in whatever it is that you're chasing after. Today with my guest and co-host for this series that we're calling Finding the Meaning Movement, Lulla. Stay with us. This episode, like all episodes of the Meaning Movement podcast, is made possible by the Calling Course. I just want to say, what do I mean by that when I say made possible? It sounds like something that they say in Sesame Street at the beginning or the end. My kids love Sesame Street. What I mean by that is this is a bootstrapped project. I have a course called the Calling Course. It's what I consider the cornerstone or flagship offering of the meaning movement. That course is all about work, all about purpose, all about navigating this space of these questions of who am I? What is my life about? Where am I going? What's my contribution going to be? Whether that's right now, in the future, whatever it might be. This podcast has expenses. We pay for those expenses via sales of that Calling Course, also through sponsorships. Share a little bit more about in just a moment. But I wanted to just, instead of talking about the Calling Course here today, wanted to share some words from a recent member of the course. This is Ryan. He sent this over and gave me permission to share this with you. So I'm going to read from him, his thoughts on being a part of the Calling Course. He says, discovering more of who I am and how that connects to the world in work is an overwhelming process. It can be hard to know where to start and easy to feel stuck. The meaning movement has been a great acceleration, affirmation, and help in this to me. The Calling Course specifically offered new perspectives and a deeper invitation into who I am and how I can walk the path to becoming my fullest self, connected to others in a mission through work. I love that so much. The combination of material, questions, and direct coaching through Q&A is powerful. I recommend it to anyone doing the hard work of walking deeper into their call. First, thank you so much, Ryan, for those words. They are just so fantastic, and I couldn't have said it better myself, which is why I'm reading them here. If you're listening or watching and you want to know more about the Calling Course, the course I open up for enrollment periodically. I don't have a set schedule at this time, but the best way to know when it's going to be the next enrollment period is going to be opening is for you to be on the email list. You can get on the email list anywhere at themeaningmovement.com. You'll find a bunch of subscribe boxes around the site, or go to the Calling Course, thecallingcourse.com. There is a free mini course. It gives just a small taste of what the calling course is all about. If you join that mini course, you'll be sure to be on the list for our next enrollment. So if any of that sounds exciting and enticing to you, make sure to jump on the email list, and then you'll be notified when that next enrollment period opens. I just want to take a quick moment to talk about sponsorship. I've always said that this podcast, this endeavor, is made possible by the calling course. What that means is it's self-funded, it's bootstrapped, but we are opening the door to sponsors to come alongside us if they're a good fit for our audience. So if you have a business, a service, or work for someone who does, that would like to get in front of an audience like ours, shoot us an email at podcast@themeaningmovement.com. We can tell you more about what we have to offer by way of our audience and sponsorship opportunities, and we can take the conversation from there. Podcast@themeaningmovement.com. Thanks so much. Raj, welcome back to the Meaning Movement podcast. I think you might be the first repeat guest in the history of the podcast.
I'm honored.
Yes, thank you. And really, as listeners are about to discover, if I haven't told them in the introduction, really like a co-host of sorts for the next, for this series at least that we're in here. So I'd love to start just by having you maybe set up this conversation and what's brought us here today.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me, first of all. So in March, you sent out an email to everybody who's been a part of the Meaning Movement, and I've been part of the Meaning Movement for a long time, so I got it. And I read the email, and to me, it reminded me a lot of the season that I had experienced last year, going through a lot of burnout. And so I reached out to you and said, hey, man, I think I've been through something pretty similar. I recommended a book to you, and then we decided to get on the phone and just see where we could go together, see if there was anything I could do to be helpful. And ultimately that's evolved into us, deciding to do this, to kind of have these conversations in public, because we think a lot of people might benefit, might be experiencing some of the same things. So I think I'll kind of just throw it back to you and ask, so you sent that email out in March. I, colloquially refer to it as the burnout email. And because that's what I read into it. Tell me about what you were experiencing in March when you sent out that email.
Yeah, just before we hit record, you called it the burnout email, and I was like, that's so funny because I don't call it the burnout email, but that also might be my resistance to actually admitting still that that's the space that I've been in. 2022 has been a rough year in many ways, and I think that the Meaning Movement has for at least the last 6 years. It's really coincidentally when the podcast started, but it's been a side project for almost that entire time. And 2022 found me pushing really hard on some of the software projects that I've been launching, and really the results of my efforts were just so far different from my expectations, and in general at a place where I don't know, things financially for me and my family felt tight. Things professionally felt like everything was shifting. The reality that I was living in was not the reality that I had expected. And a friend used this word, really, she was talking about me and lovingly correcting me, giving me some feedback on my parenting, but used the word under-resourced. And she was saying, that I was, had responded just kind of harsh to my son about something that was rather minor. And I'm so grateful that she felt the freedom and safety, I guess, of in our friendship to bring that up to me. But she's like, it just feels like you're really under resourced right now. And so that's much of what was going on. And I don't know. And before I jumped into this room to start this conversation, I was like, these are the episodes where I'm gonna see how many minutes it takes before Raj makes me cry. And so we're almost there. We're getting close. So we're 5 minutes in. But I think that's a big piece of why I really responded. I think to your response, right? Like often I put stuff out there and I don't get any response. And so the few responses that I get always are very meaningful to me. But then I think to have someone kind of see through, I guess, maybe the facade that I, whether knowingly or unknowingly, put out there of, success and professionalism, and to maybe name something that's going on beneath the surface, and in a way that I think coming from you as someone that I trust and someone who's been around
the meaning movement for so long, like,
Yeah.
felt like a really good place to start having more conversation.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, I think that that's so interesting because I think it's possible to have it be 2 things at one time, right? It can be
Mhm.
both successful and professional,
Yeah,
and also not be necessarily lucrative or exactly everything that we want or need it to be, and that
yeah.
creates this dissonance that's really hard to live with.
Mm.
One thing that you said in this word under-resourced, I wanna dive into that a little bit. Um,
Yeah,
Tell me how you were experiencing that. So you talked about, okay, so financially a little bit, but what else, that kind of came out in your parenting and obviously
yeah.
then your stress level, that how did you feel under-resourced in that time?
Yeah, I think that the first thing that comes to mind is how it feels that, like, I have this ongoing feeling that I'm just always behind,
Mm,
and, like, that there's always more to be done than can be done, and,
yeah.
just the weight of that, and so then, I try to wrap up my workday, but I still, like, feel like I didn't do enough. Like, that's a big part. I think a big part of it, like, that I'm never doing enough, um, with my work. And yeah, that's where that takes me.
Yeah. So the book that I recommended to Dan in that time was Effortless by Greg McEwen. And I can't remember if it's in the book or if it's in an interview that Greg gave about the book, but he defined burnout as the same way that the World Health Organization does. It's unmitigated workplace stress.
Mm,
And one thing that he said that was really interesting was that people who are experiencing burnout are the last people to know that they are experiencing burnout. Because just like with depression, I know that having studied psychology, a lot of people who've experienced
yeah,
depression. You and I both probably have
mhm.
at different times in our lives.
I have,
Uh,
yes.
you know, it's a thing that kind of hides itself. In order to grow, it has to be hidden. And
Mhm,
because otherwise people will surround you, they'll care about you, they'll support you, they'll get you the help that you need. And it's interesting how much depression, burnout, anxiety act like physical diseases, like viruses
mm,
that want to grow, that
yeah,
mask themselves in certain ways. And
yes,
so with burnout, people who are experiencing burnout, their brains say, "Hey, I'm not getting enough done," and
mm,
so they think, "Oh, well, in the past when I haven't gotten enough done, I just needed to work harder."
yes,
And because of this unmitigated workplace stress problem, when you work harder, you actually increase your stress and you're not able to recover from it. And so you go into the next day under resourced in energy and rest. And so then you continue to burn out further and further and further. And you're always the last person to know. So
yes.
I think it is time probably to just come out completely as I was burned out during that time,
Yes,
because I mean, you defined it exactly. Is I felt like I couldn't get enough done, and so I felt like I had
yes,
to work harder. No matter how hard I worked, I still felt behind. Now,
yeah,
there's probably some other things that go into that. The way we were raised, or other neurological things that we might
mhm,
be experiencing. But for sure, in that we can call it at least burnout and
yeah,
say, okay, then the answer to burnout isn't necessarily more effort, it's help
mhm,
and rest. And
yeah,
I know that our conversations have been part of that, have been just encouraging
yeah,
you to adopt some of the same rhythms that I learned. So, for everybody who doesn't know me, for the listeners, I experienced this really badly in 2021. Our business actually grew during the pandemic, but our staff didn't. And so
mm,
as the workload went up, I shouldered a lot of it. In the middle of 2021, I went on kind of a sabbatical, and when I came back, we hired 3 people to do parts of my job, and they were all full-time roles. So we split my job into 4 full-time roles, and I still had a full-time job on top of that. So
yes,
I literally was doing the job of at least 4 or 5 people during that time, and I felt like I was failing. Like, isn't that's the crazy thing about all of that, right? Is that
yes,
I was doing so much, I was doing too much, and still felt like I was not doing enough. That's a pretty
mhm,
classic definition of burnout, and I think you were experiencing the same thing, running,
yeah,
stuff at more than one company, trying to
yep,
keep the meeting movement successful, caring for your family, all of
yeah.
that. I think we could pretty classically define that as burnout.
Okay, I'm ready, Raj. I
Today's the day.
I I was burnt out and probably still am burnt out,
Yeah.
to be honest. But I do think that I'm, with help from folks like you, like finding resources, bringing more resources around me, to, I think both to help me care for myself as well as, I think steward, the meaning movement, in a positive and helpful direction. So I'm
Yeah.
ready to admit, ready to come clean. I'm ready to become part of Burnouts Anonymous. Is there an identity piece? I'm a burnt out. That doesn't really rhyme. That doesn't really fit. But
You know what's
yeah.
funny is I went to the Story Brand conference in Nashville last fall, and they knew how hard of a year it had been for everybody. And so instead of handing out awards to certain standout people, they actually handed out these certificates that we were supposed to fill out for ourselves. And I have a little bit of a twisted sense of humor. So because you had to name your award and then you had to say what it was for. And so you put in your name. So I award Raj Lulla the blank award. And so I called it the Anakin Skywalker Award for surviving being burnt to a crisp. Again, a twisted sense of humor.
So good. So good.
And hopefully I've not come out a villain on the other side of it. But
Yes. Yes.
yeah, I mean, so whatever the I am statement is, I went with burnt
Yes.
to a crisp because it
I
really
love
felt
it.
that
Well,
way for a while.
yeah, definitely fits. I love it.
My kids will appreciate that. They love that scene in the movie. So, so one of the things that's so interesting about burnout is, I've been following the meaning movement for 8 years, and I actually went back and found the email after you and I started
Wild.
talking, and
8 years.
so looking at the meaning movement this whole time, from the outside I would have said, man, Dan is so successful. He knows how to build a course, and he's changed people's lives through walking through this stuff with them. And so from the outside, I would have just seen it as completely successful. Would not even known, that finances were a struggle or stress or anything like that. And so I'd love if you just kind of share with the
Yeah.
listeners, in the 8 years that I've been exposed to the meaning movement, and that a lot of us have, there's over 5,000 people or about that in the meaning movement community. What has changed in those
Yeah.
8 years?
Yeah. So in those 8 years, when I started the meaning movement, it's kind of a fuzzy start, a gradual start. But 2012, 2013, somewhere in there. The podcast around 2016. When I started the podcast or started the whole project, it was primarily I was fresh out of grad school and was trying to figure out how to move the needle around meaning, purpose, calling, helping people answer these existential questions of why we exist. And I was doing that a lot through one-on-one coaching, primarily through my network, people introducing, friends, clients, whatever, people to me who are kind of struggling with those questions. But I had this just deep sense that I wanted to reach more than just one-on-one work. And I went to grad school. A lot of people in my program or the program most adjacent to mine came out as therapists, and we're doing a lot of one-on-one work. And I just wanted something that was more scalable, and that's what really prompted me to bring the meeting movement online, literally onto the internet, and then eventually start the podcast, build out the course, and everything along those lines. What's shifted in that time is that all along there that time, at least for the first few years, I always felt like, okay, I'm gonna find the right recipe for the meaning movement to make it, a financially, the word that I usually use is financially sustainable business. It's always been a income generating business, but never enough for a growing family. And I've always had other projects along those lines. And so even as I've pursued growing the meaning movement, I started, exploring like how do I learn how to run a business? How do I start something on the internet? And that led me to opportunities, open doors, got me into the software world just through just trying to equip myself. And so I think, the main thing that's changed, I think is, in a lot of ways, is me. I feel like I'm a different person now than I was when I started. I know a lot more than when I started. And yet I feel like when I look at the meaning movement, I look at the challenges to making it a more sustainable business. Like I feel like I'm still seeing it through the eyes of the 2012 Dan, who hasn't spent the last, better part of a decade learning how to run businesses and equipping myself as an entrepreneur. And then the other thing that's changed is like culture's changed, which I know I've talked about a bit, and I think we'll talk about more in upcoming episodes. But like I feel like I don't know, I'm a different person, the world's a different place, and I'm not sure how to apply. I want to say applied pressure, apply effort, but that feels like more just more burnout talk to the meaning movement to take it where it wants to go, or where I
Yeah.
want it to go. Does that begin to answer your question?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. It's interesting. We talked about this a little briefly earlier in the episode, just this idea that something could be successful and not necessarily be lucrative.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about that. It's
Yep.
funny because being sort of in the audience of the meaning movement, when you talk about it like a business, it doesn't necessarily resonate with me, but I don't have a problem with it because like I know everybody's
Yep.
got to make a living. It's a little bit
Yeah.
more that I I think I've always kind of been waiting for it to sort of become a movement, like where
Yeah.
it's sort of like, yeah, where is everybody who's doing this together? I was surprised to learn that there's 5,000. I guess not really surprised, but like sometimes it can feel like so quiet. And I know that being on the other side, owning a business, it can feel like all I do is talk about this, and so all I do is try
Yep.
to put it out there and I don't get much in return. So as we go into this next sort of season of the meaning movement, not the podcast, but just like the next, life
Phase.
stage
Yeah.
of the meaning movement. What are you thinking about? What are you thinking? Because again, I don't have any problem if you make your living do this. In fact, I prefer you make your living doing this.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but what are you starting to kind of feel, even if you don't have concrete
Yeah.
answers yet, but what are you starting to feel might need to evolve within the meaning movement?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And so first, I think what I want to address is like that doesn't feel like a business. And I think the why I want it to
Yeah.
be more of a business, and is because this is where like I get fired up about this stuff, and I
Yeah.
love like doing this work, having the conversations that I have on the podcast, doing the work that I like, being on the Q&As with people who are part of the course, like all of that, and getting to be a part of that transformation that in people's lives. Like I want to do that, but I have limited capacity when I have to be doing my other things to make a living. And so
Yeah.
in some ways it's I think a requirement, if the meaning movement is going to be get the attention and time that it deserves. Like I have to find a way to actually increase the revenue from it. And so that's a part of it. And the things that I'm thinking about is that like calling, purpose, fulfillment, passion, vocation, whatever words we want to use to talk about these ideas of what the meaning movement is about, are such soft outcomes. They're the kind of things that everyone's like, yeah, I like doing stuff that's fulfilling, but it's
I'd
not
like to
like,
have
yeah,
meaning. Yeah.
yeah, I like to have meaning. I like to feel like what I'm doing matters, but it's not a present enough, I don't know, pain point. I think,
Yeah.
for a lot of people to be like, yeah, and I'm gonna spend hundreds, if not thousands of dollars to get better at this in this area of my
Yeah.
life. So one of the things I'm thinking a lot about, and you and I are talking a lot about, is who's the target demographic, and how can we focus those words onto more specific pain points in order to like find those people that will resonate most deeply and be like, this is solving something very present and needed in my life in a way that I want to, like, that's
Yeah.
that's important and valuable enough to me that it's worth investing some time and money
Yeah.
into.
So
Yeah.
I think something that's interesting, and hopefully people are hanging with us here in talking in this way about the meaning movement, is that the reason that we're doing it is because you committed to something very brave with me.
Mm.
What I do for a living is branding and strategy for companies and businesses, and you committed to having these conversations in public to
Yeah.
and so people don't necessarily like to think of themselves as a demographic or like to think of themselves as having pain
Yes.
points, but the reason why we're doing this in public is because essentially you need the meaning movement. Like everybody that we've talked to over the last 8 years, it's all been about how do I connect the things that I care the most about
Yeah.
with the work that
Mm.
I'm doing, or if I'm already successful in the work that I'm doing but it doesn't feel successful, how do I get that sense of meaning, that sense of purpose in
Yes.
what I spend 75% of my waking hours doing, and probably even more time than that
Yes.
thinking about? And so if it ever gets uncomfortable in having these conversations for the audience, for listeners here, it's because we're all going through the same thing. Like the reason that we all listen and connect to the meaning movement is because we're constantly trying to stay engaged, stay ignited on those things that we care about. And there's this tension in adult life of, I have to do certain things to pay the rent, to make sure there's food on the table, to make sure that my car isn't falling apart, all of those things. I have to do certain activities. But then I also have the stuff that really makes my heart light up. And
Yes.
so how do I combine those things, or how do I figure out the right balance of those things? And I think you're incredibly brave for being willing to show people what it's like to go through this transformation, to be willing to look at 10 years worth of work and say, I know that I have to do something different to make a transformation here so that I can both have the internal meaning that I want, the purpose, whatever,
Mhm.
again, whatever words we use around that, but then also am able to provide for my family and do the things that I identify as most important to my existence and the different roles that I
Yes.
play as husband, father, all those
Yes.
things. So along those lines, as we go into this kind of series of episodes, I think we've called them Finding the Meaning Movement.
Yes.
And so as we're doing that, what do you hope that people will hear in your
Mhm.
transparency in our conversations? What do you hope that people
Yep.
will resonate with as we're doing the brave thing of
Yes.
building this in public and
I
exposing it
love
in
it.
public? What do you hope people
Yes.
will hear?
Yeah, thank you for framing this way, because I think it's super important that listeners know, why are we having this conversation? Why are we having this conversation with them as listeners? And so I think that your question is exactly right. What do I hope that they'll hear? I think that, like, the work that I'm doing with the meaning movement, with not just the meaning, with my life, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's a meta narrative, if you will. It's a lens, like what I'm doing right now with the meaning movement, with my desire, with my, this energy to create change in the world, is the same thing that so many people who are listening to this podcast are doing or thinking about doing in their own lives. And so my hope is that by doing it in public, by having these conversations in public, that there will be some sort of crossover, I guess, that
Yeah.
this work, the work that I'm doing, could fuel the work that listeners, that all of you are doing in your own lives, around in your own journey. If nothing else, just to know that, like, you've got company, but maybe something else along the way, maybe questions that we're entertaining, that Raj and I are talking about, resonate at a deeper level, and these questions that we're asking each other can also be the questions that you're, as a stand-in for you, are being asked of you. And
Yeah.
so that's really, what my hope is. If there's one thing that I'm good at, it's crying in public. That's and so, like, this building in public aspect of this is like, feels like a, I don't know, maybe just a logical outgrowth of that. Just one more thought on that. I remember in grad school, when I went to grad school, I had just come out of probably a season of burnout that I didn't want to call burnout, um, as a youth pastor, and I knew I had a lot of energy around calling and vocation, and started doing all kinds of stuff in grad school around that, but didn't really know what to do with it, or what I was going to do with, my life after grad school. But, like, towards the end of my experience there, I kind of began to name, like, I really want to help people with these very questions. And I remember
Yeah.
very vividly a friend of mine being like, so this is kind of meta, but, like, your work is helping other people find their work. I'm like,
Yeah.
that's exactly right. And that's also what I hope these conversations, how they serve as, like, a meta conversation, if you will. The work that I'm doing on the meaning movement, the work that I'm doing in my own life, is, a direct parallel, I hope, to the work that other people are doing, and that this project itself is inviting people to.
Yeah. So I think as we kind of wrap up this first one, I
Yeah.
want to repeat back some things that I heard that I think are worth paying some attention to. The first one is that you've got to be able to identify the problem to start with. Like, if you
Mm.
find yourself shorter with your kids, or shorter on finances, or that word under resourced is so great,
Yeah.
because if you feel like you're running that treadmill and it's just getting a little bit ahead of you, and you feel like you're inching a couple of inches back on it every day, and you feel like you're going to fall off at some point, you're in the right place.
Yeah.
Dan is willing to admit this and say it publicly, and I went through it. And so If you're
Yes.
listening and you've been through it, then, or going through it, you're in the right place. And it takes some bravery just to admit that. And so, Dan, I think that's part of the reason why I even reached out, was because I know that you're somebody who's capable of having this conversation in public. You
Mm.
are willing to, I know you call it cry in public, but you're willing to be vulnerable. You're willing to open up. And I think that's why people, including me, trust you. And
Mhm.
and there's something really brave and valuable there. I think another thing that is worth thinking about there is, like you talked about building this over, 8, 10, 12 years, and being willing to look at where you are and say, hey, this isn't working the way that I want it to.
Yeah.
So, first kind of admitting that you're struggling, and then second, being willing to open it back up and say, okay, I'm not going to be too attached to the past. I'm not going to be too attached to the way that things were. I'm
Mhm.
willing to change. That's a whole
Yeah.
huge step by itself. And then
Mhm.
the third thing is, when we're talking about why to build it in public, what I heard you saying was, why are we building the meaning movement as a business in front of the people who will probably buy from this business, is because it's theirs. It's ours. Like,
Mhm.
you
Yeah.
brought
Love
literally an
that.
audience member in to host this with you because it belongs to us. It's a movement. It's a
Yeah.
community of people. And if you're not helping people move into their best work, and to find success in their own work, then you're not doing your best work either. And so we have to
Yes.
go through this together.
Yes.
And I'm really excited for everybody to get to go along this journey with us. Like you said, I think we're going to be able to look into our own selves and say, oh yeah, I've been there too. It is definitely not just Dan. It's definitely not just Raj. I've been there too. I've had to look myself in the mirror. Maybe I need to look myself in the mirror right now.
Mhm.
And as we all build this together, it's ours. Like, it's all of ours. Anybody who's been following along, or anybody who's brand new to the meaning movement, it wouldn't be anything without people going on this journey, being willing to go on this journey. And so those are the three things I heard you say. Being
Love
willing
it.
to identify that you're having a problem, being willing to change, and then it's ours. We got to go through this together. Do you
Mm.
think, did I capture that in the way that you think you would?
Yeah, so well. And like I think the way that I've talked about it with my wife, I think one, yeah, admitting it, to like being willing to the way I talk about that point is like it's gotta go one way or the other. I either need to blow it up and a phoenix rises from the
Mhm.
ashes, or it just blows up
Yeah.
and that's the end, and like it's because like it's not doing it justice, it's not doing the audience justice, it's not doing me justice for it to just be in like barely any attention, barely any resource maintenance mode as it has been. And then just on that third piece, I just love that you frame it that way, because that's really how I've always wanted. Like I called it the meaning movement because I want it to be a movement, but
Yeah.
it just has never felt like that to me. Like
Yeah.
as much as I want it to be, like it usually just feels like me, me,
Yeah.
and now right at this moment I have a team of a podcast editor and producer, and like there's some other players behind the scenes, but still it's at the end of the day it's just me, and I don't want it to feel that way. I want it to feel like a community. I want it to feel like it has legs, like it's moving. So
Yeah.
thank you for
Yeah.
framing it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for everybody who's listening, if you, like Dan, like me, have struggled with that feeling of, I know that I've got something good, and whether
Mm.
that's a job that's already successful, or just an internal talent or gifting or passion, a framework, an idea, a book, whatever it is, but it doesn't feel successful yet, you're in the right place. We're going to be
Yeah.
building this in front of you, with you.
Mm.
And feel free to reach out. Feel free to type Dan some encouragement, send an email back like I did. He does read them. This is
Do you read
pure
them,
evidence of
everyone?
that. And then also, you be sharing your ideas and thoughts of what you want this to be, the ways that we should be connecting with each other, and going through these ideas and frameworks that Dan has been presenting over the last 10 years. What are we missing? What do we need in order to build this thing to a movement, to a community of people who really not only have something that we know is successful, but it also begins to feel successful. That's what these next episodes, the Finding the Meaning movement, are going to be about.
I love it. Thank you so much, Raj. This is so great. Excited to keep going in the process with you.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you so much, Raj. So fun to have a co-host for this mini-series, and listeners, viewers, thank you for tuning in. Raj and I are going to be doing these mini-series every 5 or so episodes throughout the season, and hopefully even beyond, as we continue to explore and unpack my own process building in public with the Meaning Movement. I hope that you'll join us on this Finding the Meaning Movement series. You'll find it just alongside all the other episodes in the podcast feed on YouTube, in the feed there. We'll put it in a playlist there as well. If you're not following along, make sure to hit that subscribe button wherever you're watching on YouTube or in your podcast catcher to make sure you'll see and know when the next episode in this series drops. If you haven't left a rating or review wherever you're watching, if you're on YouTube, hit that thumbs up. If you're listening in a podcast catcher that allows for ratings and reviews, please take a moment to do that. This is an independent podcast. There's not a huge team behind this. We don't have a lot of resources, but we're competing against these big teams with lots of resources, celebrities, brands, podcast houses like Gimlet, WNYC, NPR, all of these big organizations, and it's just me, Raj, and a few other folks along the way, all paid for by yours truly, and with the help of some great collaborators like Raj. All that is to say, anything that you can do to contribute to help just goes so far because we are such a small operation. So please take a moment and leave a rating, review, hit that thumbs up, hit that subscribe button, and I would just be so grateful. I'll be back with Raj for another installment of this series in 2 weeks' time, but we'll be back in just a few days with our next episode of this season. We'll see you then. Our music is by Tom Roram. Our artwork is by Eleazar Ruiz. We'll be back with you shortly.